and winter expected failure. Before you drift any deeper, if this quiet helps you feel safe tonight, you're welcome to stay with us. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and lets these nights continue. Now, rest. At minus 30 degrees, the world stops negotiating. Batteries fail, engines hesitate, human confidence quietly reconsiders its life choices. In that kind of cold, survival is supposed to belong to heavy things. Thick walls, dense stone, stubborn timber stacked until it feels reassuring. And yet history left us a contradiction so calm, it almost feels rude. In the coldest winds on open plains, the structure that endured best was not massive, fortified, or intimidating. It was light. It was portable. It leaned slightly, like it wasn't taking winter personally. At minus 30 degrees, the most unassuming shape on the landscape turned out to be the smartest thing humans ever built. That contradiction is where tonight begins, because when we imagine living through extreme cold, we imagine resistance. We imagine sealing ourselves in, building thicker, heavier, stronger. We picture walls that fight the weather, roofs that dare snow to try harder, doors that shut the world out completely. The logic feels obvious. Winter is aggressive, so architecture should be aggressive back. Stone answers snow, timber answers wind. Serious problems require serious buildings. And yet, none of that logic survived the plains very well. On the open grasslands of North America, where winter arrived without mountains to soften it or forests to slow it down, people thrived inside something that looked, at first glance, almost insultingly simple. A cone, a triangle standing at rest, no bricks, no mortar, no permanent foundation, just poles, hides, and an understanding of how cold actually behaves when no one is pretending to be in control. This introduction is not about a tent. That misunderstanding has already done enough damage. This is about a system. A system that didn't challenge winter, didn't dominate it, didn't attempt to overpower it with weight and ego. Instead, it observed. It adjusted. And then it quietly worked, year after year, while far more serious buildings struggled, smoked, collapsed, or froze their occupants into silence. There is something deeply unsettling about that. Modern instincts tell us that intelligence looks complex, that good design announces itself loudly, that survival must involve visible effort. But the structure we're easing into tonight didn't look like it was trying at all. It stood there calmly, like a shape that already knew the outcome. Wind slid past it. Snow failed to stay. Heat circulated without argument. And the people inside slept, while the world outside performed its seasonal tantrum. If this had been invented by someone wearing powdered wigs or drafting blueprints in marble halls, we would never stop talking about it. There would be diagrams, exhibitions, reverent documentaries narrated by voices that take architecture far too seriously. Instead, history often summarized it with one dismissive word: tent. That word has done a lot of harm, because calling this structure a tent is like calling a compass a shiny needle. It misses the point so thoroughly that it becomes almost impressive. This was not temporary shelter, in the sense we usually mean. It was not a compromise. It was not a last resort. It was a deliberate answer to a very specific environment, refined through generations of people who did not have the luxury of being wrong. Winter on the plains does not forgive design mistakes. At minus 30 degrees, you don't get a second draft. You don't get a learning curve. You either understand wind, heat, snow, and air, or you become part of the landscape in a way no one intended. And yet, instead of escalating complexity, this system simplified. Instead of adding mass, it adjusted shape. Instead of trapping heat aggressively, it guided it gently. The result wasn't dramatic. It was stable, and stability in extreme environments is the highest compliment available. There's also something quietly humorous about the comparison that follows, though winter itself does not appreciate jokes. Many modern buildings packed with insulation, technology, and confidence react to snow like it's a personal insult. Roofs panic, gutters fail, heating systems spiral emotionally. Meanwhile, a structure made from wood and animal hides sits there unbothered, allowing snow to slide away, as if it were never invited in the first place. That contrast is not accidental. It is philosophical. The people who built and lived in these structures did not see themselves as opponents of the environment. They didn't believe comfort came from domination. They understood that the cold had rules, and that those rules could be followed without submission. The shape didn't argue with wind. It redirected it. It didn't trap snow. It declined it politely. It didn't hoard heat. It circulated it, the way warm air prefers to move when no one interferes. This opening is about expectations failing quietly. Winter expected resistance. It expected friction. It expected to find weaknesses in corners, edges, and flat surfaces. What it encountered instead was a form that refused to give it leverage, a structure that didn't care how loud the storm became, because volume wasn't part of the conversation. And this is where we slow down. Because the story that follows does not need urgency. Nothing here is trying to impress you. No one is asking for admiration. The brilliance of this system lies in how little it demands attention. It functioned without explanation, without ceremony, and without apology. People lived. Fires burned modestly. Air moved where it was supposed to. And winter, for all its confidence, never quite won. So tonight, as we ease into this shape that history underestimated, we are not studying an artifact. We are listening to a lesson delivered without words, a reminder that survival does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it stands quietly on the plains, shaped like a triangle at rest, waiting patiently for the cold to make the first mistake. And that, gently, is where we begin. The shape that refused to argue with wind. The most intelligent structures don't confront nature. They quietly deny it, leverage. When winter arrives on open land, it does not knock. It does not negotiate. It moves sideways, fast, and without apology. Wind on the plains has no obstacles to soften it, no mountains to break its confidence, no forest to persuade it to slow down. It travels uninterrupted for hundreds of miles, gaining speed, learning momentum, and developing a personality best described as persistent. In that environment, any structure that insists on standing firm, square, and proud quickly learns how fragile pride can be. This is where the shape begins to matter. Most buildings humans instinctively create are confrontational by design. Flat walls present themselves directly to the wind as if daring it to try harder. Sharp corners collect pressure. Roof lines catch snow and invite it to stay longer than anyone asked. These forms assume that resisting nature is the same thing as surviving it. On paper, that logic sounds respectable. In practice, It leaks heat, traps snow, and slowly turns maintenance into a full-time occupation. The cone chose a different approach. It did not resist the wind. It declined the conversation entirely. Wind does not collide with a cone. It arrives, glances upward, and continues on its way, slightly disappointed. There is no surface wide enough to absorb its force, no edge sharp enough to grip, no corner where pressure can gather and plot something dramatic. The airflow slides up and around the structure, redirected rather than challenged, like a river encountering a smooth stone instead of a wall. This is not an accident of aesthetics. It is physics behaving politely when given no reason to misbehave. In the cold, wind is not just uncomfortable, it is aggressive theft. Every gust strips heat from surfaces, pulling warmth away molecule by molecule. Flat walls offer wind an easy target. The cone offers none. By narrowing as it rises, the structure reduces the surface area exposed to the strongest currents, minimizing heat loss without sealing itself into suffocation. The shape does not trap air defensively, it guides it intelligently. And perhaps the most elegant part is how little effort this requires. There are no moving parts here, no adjustments, no decisions to make in the middle of a storm. The shape performs its function simply by existing. Snow, meanwhile, is a different kind of problem, quieter but equally determined. Snow does not attack, it accumulates. It settles into places where gravity hesitates, where angles invite rest. Flat roofs invite responsibility. Pitched roofs reduce it. The cone eliminates it entirely. Snow does not belong on a cone. It slides away almost immediately, unable to find a place to linger. There is no weight building overhead, no silent pressure increasing while occupants sleep beneath it. The structure does not ask for help. No one needs to climb onto a roof in freezing wind, negotiating with gravity and regret. The snow leaves on its own, as if realizing it has overstayed its welcome. This is not convenience. This is survival without spectacle. Modern architecture often treats snow like a problem to be managed. Load calculations, reinforcements, contingency plans. The cone treats snow like a misunderstanding. It offers no flat surface to misunderstand. Gravity takes care of the rest. There is something subtly humorous about how confident this looks in practice. Storms arrive with enthusiasm, wind howls with theatrical commitment, snow falls like it has something to prove, and the structure remains unimpressed. Not defiant, not heroic, just uninterested. The Tipi does not fight the storm. It does not need to. It simply refuses to give the storm anything useful to work with. That refusal is where its intelligence lives. When force has nothing to push against, it loses relevance. When pressure cannot gather, it dissipates. The cone understands this without explanation. It does not need reinforcement because it never accepts stress in the first place. Forces travel downward, smoothly, into the ground, distributed across poles that bend slightly rather than snapping in protest. This flexibility matters more than strength. Rigid structures fail suddenly. Flexible ones adapt quietly. In wind, rigidity becomes a liability. A structure that refuses to move absorbs energy until it breaks. The cone yields just enough to survive. It sways, it breathes, it responds. Movement becomes cooperation rather than weakness. The storm expends its energy elsewhere, searching for something more stubborn to argue with. And that search usually succeeds. Just not here. There is also a psychological comfort hidden inside this geometry, though it rarely gets mentioned. Inside a cone, sound behaves differently. Wind noise moves upward, diffused, rather than amplified. The structure does not howl or rattle dramatically. It hums. The storm becomes background rather than threat, something acknowledged but not allowed center stage. This matters when darkness lasts longer than patience. When the environment is hostile, the difference between panic and calm often comes down to whether your shelter feels reactive or stable. The cone feels finished. It does not communicate anxiety. It does not sound like it's struggling. It gives no indication that conditions outside are winning. That quiet stability allows the mind to rest. There is a temptation to romanticize this shape as clever minimalism, but that would miss the point. This was not simplicity for its own sake. This was precision. Every angle served a purpose. Every curve responded to a pattern observed over time. Wind behaves consistently. Snow obeys gravity. Cold moves predictably when air is allowed to flow as it prefers. The cone did not invent these rules. It respected them. This respect created something counterintuitive, a structure that appears delicate but performs relentlessly. A form that looks temporary yet endures, a shape that seems passive but actively denies the environment any advantage. And here is where we begin to understand why form must come before material. Because once the shape is correct, materials are no longer fighting uphill. Wood does not need to be massive. Hide does not need to be thick beyond necessity. Insulation becomes guidance rather than barricade. Heat behaves. Smoke behaves. Everything downstream of the shape starts working with less effort. This is why buildings that copy materials without understanding form always fail. You can borrow stone, timber, steel, insulation, technology, but if the shape argues with the environment, the argument never ends. The cone never started one. As we move forward, we'll see how this foundational decision allowed every other element of the structure to succeed effortlessly. Poles could be lighter, coverings could be flexible, heat could circulate rather than accumulate uselessly above. The shape created conditions where intelligence multiplied instead of compensated. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson hiding here. The most effective solutions do not announce themselves as solutions. They remove problems so thoroughly that effort becomes optional. The cone did not conquer winter. It simply gave winter nothing to conquer. When the shape was right, everything else finally had permission to work. And that is where the materials begin to matter. The quiet confidence of wooden poles. True engineering confidence appears when nothing is oversized, overbuilt, or uncertain. Once the shape had quietly solved the problem of wind and snow, the structure no longer needed to prove anything. It did not require excess. It did not demand bulk. What it needed next was something far less dramatic and far more difficult to achieve. Balance. This is where the wooden poles enter the story, not as background material, but as deliberate participants in a system that already understood restraint. The poles used to raise these structures were not impressive in the way modern materials like to be impressive. They were not thick. They were not heavy. They did not arrive with guarantees or measurements stamped into their sides. Instead, they were slim, straight, flexible, and quietly capable. Lodgepole pine, as it came to be known, was not chosen because it was abundant alone. It was chosen because it was sufficient in every direction that mattered. That sufficiency is easy to underestimate. A lodgepole pine grows tall and narrow, competing closely with its neighbors for light. In doing so, it develops the exact qualities this structure required: straightness without rigidity, strength without mass, flexibility without fragility. It could be lifted by a single person. It could be transported repeatedly. It could bend under stress without failing. And when arranged correctly, it could shoulder forces that would humiliate far heavier beams. Nothing about this was accidental. Choosing the right poles was not a matter of wandering into the forest and hoping for the best. It was not guesswork. It was not improvisation disguised as tradition. The selection process reflected intimate familiarity with the landscape, the trees, and the long-term behavior of materials under pressure. People knew which trees twisted, which snapped, which warped over time, which stayed loyal. This kind of knowledge does not announce itself. It accumulates quietly, generation after generation, through attention rather than experimentation. Modern humans, by contrast, often struggle with choices far less demanding. Selecting a ripe avocado has become a minor emotional ordeal involving excessive squeezing and a lingering sense of regret. Meanwhile, entire communities selected structural materials with confidence refined through lived consequences. If a pole failed, Winter noticed, there were no returns. Once chosen, the poles were not arranged randomly. The structure began, as many stable systems do, with 3 points. A tripod, not 4. Not because 4 is wrong, but because 3 is sufficient. 3 points define a plane. 3 points create stability without indecision. The tripod formed the spine of the structure, the quiet agreement that everything else would align itself around. These 3 poles were tied together at the top, raised carefully and planted firmly into the ground. This act alone solved several problems at once. It established height. It created a central axis. It allowed forces to travel downward cleanly without confusion. The structure did not wobble because it did not need to negotiate where its weight belonged. Once the tripod stood, the remaining poles followed a spiral pattern, wrapping around the frame in a deliberate sequence. This spiral was not decorative. It distributed weight evenly. It prevented weak points. It created a continuous load path from the top of the structure down into the earth. Each pole leaned against the next, sharing responsibility rather than isolating it. This cooperative geometry mattered. In strong winds, pressure shifts constantly. A rigid frame resists until it fails. A cooperative frame adapts, redistributing stress moment by moment. The spiral allowed the structure to respond dynamically, not dramatically. When wind pushed one side, the entire frame acknowledged it together, flexing just enough to remain intact. Nothing was overbuilt because nothing needed to compensate for poor design. There is a subtle elegance in how these poles aged alongside the people who used them. They were not disposable. They were not replaced seasonally. A family's poles traveled with them year after year across distances that would exhaust modern furniture within weeks. They were repaired when needed, retired when truly finished, and often passed down with stories attached. Imagine a house whose walls remembered where they had been. Modern construction tends to treat materials as static and interchangeable. A beam is a beam, a stud is a stud. But here materials were partners. They accumulated history. Their behavior was understood not in abstract terms, but through lived familiarity. A slightly bowed pole was not a flaw. It was a known personality trait. That familiarity created trust. Because the poles were light, the entire structure remained portable. Because they were strong, portability did not sacrifice safety. Because they were reused, efficiency became tradition rather than innovation. Nothing here chased novelty. Everything served continuity. And perhaps most importantly, the poles did not dominate the structure. They supported it. They obeyed the shape established earlier. They did not fight wind because the shape already handled that conversation. They did not hold snow because the cone had declined that responsibility. Their role was simpler and therefore more powerful, to hold everything exactly where it needed to be, and no more. This is restraint as engineering philosophy. Once the frame stood, confident and unassuming, the structure reached a critical moment. It was complete in form, but empty in experience. It could stand, it could endure wind, it could shrug off snow, but standing is not the same as living. The question shifted quietly, without urgency. How does this become warm? This is where many designs fail. They focus so intensely on structure that comfort becomes an afterthought. Insulation is layered aggressively, heat is forced, air is trapped. The result is often warmth that feels unstable, expensive, and slightly hostile to breathe. Here, the opposite approach waited patiently. Because the frame was light, it did not steal heat unnecessarily. Because it was open in its logic, it allowed the next layer to work intelligently. The poles created a skeleton that invited warmth rather than imprisoning it. They defined space without sealing it prematurely. The confidence of the wooden poles lay not in their dominance, but in their refusal to interfere. They did not pretend to be the solution to cold. They simply made sure the solution had room to succeed. And with the frame now standing, balanced, cooperative, and prepared, the story moves inward, away from structure and toward sensation, toward warmth, not as force, but as flow. Because when the skeleton is right, the skin can finally do its work. And that is where the cold begins to lose interest. A house wrapped in an animal that never froze. The most effective insulation is not invented, it is inherited. Once the frame stood quietly in place, balanced and cooperative, the structure was ready for something that would change its relationship with the cold entirely. Not thickness, not weight, not an aggressive barrier designed to bully winter into submission. What it needed was memory, stored warmth, earned through generations of survival. This is where the buffalo entered the architecture. A buffalo is not an animal that negotiates with winter. It does not migrate away from cold winds or wait politely for spring to return. It stands in open landscapes where temperatures plunge and storms arrive unannounced. Snow settles on its back and does not melt. Wind passes over its body and leaves disappointed. Its survival strategy is not urgency but endurance. Wrapping a home in the hide of such an animal was not symbolism. It was logic. Modern outdoor clothing companies spend fortunes attempting to replicate what a buffalo developed naturally over millennia. Layered insulation, dense fur, thick hide, air trapped in just the right places. A buffalo hide is not merely warm, it is unfairly warm. Warm in a way that feels slightly insulting to synthetic fabrics that promise performance, and then quietly disappoint you on a windy sidewalk. A buffalo lived outdoors its entire life. If something could keep that animal alive through winters that made trees crack audibly, then that something deserved respect. And so the hide became the outer skin of the structure, not as decoration, but as proven technology. This is biology functioning as engineering. The hide blocked wind, not by sealing itself rigidly, but by absorbing it. The dense fur disrupted airflow at the surface, slowing it down before it could steal heat. Beneath that fur, the hide itself provided mass, enough to resist penetration, but not so much that it became inflexible. Snow beaded and slid. Moisture struggled to enter. Heat stayed where it belonged. Unlike many modern materials, buffalo hide did not require perfection to function. Small imperfections did not cause catastrophic failure. The system tolerated wear because it was designed around use, not ideal conditions. The process of preparing these hides was not casual. It was skilled work refined over generations. The hides were cleaned, softened, and treated using methods that preserved flexibility without sacrificing strength. Sinew, strong, flexible, and surprisingly durable, was used to stitch multiple hides into a single continuous covering. These seams were not weaknesses. They were intentional pathways, aligned carefully so wind flowed across them instead of through them. Nothing here was improvised. When draped over the frame, the hide covering followed the shape exactly. It did not fight the geometry, it embraced it. The cone allowed the hide to sit under tension, shedding water and snow while remaining stable in high winds. The material and the shape cooperated so thoroughly that neither had to overperform. And here is where the subtle humor enters. If buffalo hide insulation were introduced today, it would not be humble. It would arrive with marketing. Words like artisan, heritage, and eco-luxury would appear immediately. There would be waiting lists. Influencers would pose dramatically in it while pretending not to be cold. The price would be high, and the performance would be described as revolutionary. In reality, this revolution already happened. It simply didn't ask for applause. What made the hide especially effective was not just warmth, but adaptability. In winter, additional hides could be layered for increased insulation. In warmer seasons, sections could be lifted or adjusted to encourage airflow. The structure did not lock itself into a single mode of existence. It responded to conditions without rebuilding itself. This flexibility extended beyond temperature. Buffalo hide resisted moisture exceptionally well. Snow slid off, rain beaded and ran away, wind lost interest. Inside, the air felt calmer, quieter, and noticeably warmer, not in a dramatic way, but in a way that allowed people to continue living without constant awareness of the cold. That is a critical distinction. Survival that demands attention is exhausting. Survival that fades into the background becomes life. There was also an ethic embedded in this choice of material. The buffalo was not used partially. Meat, bones, sinew, fat, and hide all served purposes. Nothing was wasted. The hide was not a disposable commodity. It was a gift that demanded care, respect, and maintenance. This ethic shaped the structure itself. The covering was repaired rather than replaced. It aged alongside the people it sheltered. Marks and wear told stories rather than signaling failure. A repaired seam was not shameful. It was evidence of continuity. Modern materials tend to hide their aging. Buffalo hide accepted it. Inside, the effect was immediate and profound. The outer world could rage, but the interior remained insulated from urgency. The hide muted sound as much as it blocked cold. Wind became a distant presence rather than a constant threat. Snowstorms announced themselves visually, not thermally. And yet, warmth alone was not enough. This is where many designs misunderstand comfort. They focus entirely on keeping heat in, forgetting that air must still move. Without airflow, warmth becomes oppressive. Smoke lingers, moisture accumulates. The interior grows stale and survival becomes uncomfortable in quieter, more insidious ways. The buffalo hide solved only part of the equation. It created the boundary. It established protection. But once warmth is secured, the more delicate challenge begins. How do you control air without losing heat? How do you breathe without inviting winter back inside? This is the point where brute insulation fails and intelligence takes over. The hide, for all its brilliance, was not expected to solve everything. It did not pretend to be airtight. It allowed the next layer of design to do its work without interference. It blocked what needed blocking and permitted what needed movement. The structure was warm, yes, but not sealed. That distinction matters more than it sounds, because comfort is not just temperature. It is balance. It is the ability to sit, sleep, cook, and breathe without constantly managing the environment. It is the absence of drafts without the presence of suffocation. It is warmth that feels steady rather than trapped. The buffalo hide made that balance possible by setting boundaries without rigidity. And so, with the structure now wrapped in the accumulated wisdom of an animal that never froze, the system faced its next quiet challenge. Not more insulation, not thicker walls, but direction. Air needed guidance, because once warmth is secured, it must be allowed to move wisely, or it becomes a problem of its own. And that is where the interior begins to matter. The air never stood still. Warmth is not something you trap. It is something you guide. Once the structure was wrapped in the memory of an animal that never froze, winter lost its most obvious advantages. Wind no longer rushed in uninvited. Heat no longer escaped without explanation. The interior became calm, insulated, and quietly resilient. But warmth, when left alone, has a tendency to become selfish. It rises, it gathers, it abandons the places where people actually live. This is where many shelters fail. Not because they cannot generate heat, but because they do not know what to do with it once it arrives. Inside this structure, the air was never allowed to stand still. Hanging several inches inside the outer hide was an inner lining, a second wall that appeared deceptively simple. It did not shout innovation. It did not gleam. It did not demand admiration. But it changed everything. This lining created a narrow pocket of air between itself and the outer covering, transforming the entire structure into a double-wall insulation system long before anyone felt the need to name it. That pocket of air was not decorative. It was deliberate. Air, when trapped thoughtfully, becomes insulation. When guided carefully, it becomes circulation. The space between the outer hide and the inner lining allowed warm air from the central fire to rise, slip upward through the gap, and then gently descend along the interior walls. Instead of racing to the ceiling and abandoning the floor to cold, heat was persuaded to behave like a responsible guest. The result was an interior where warmth circulated evenly, quietly, and without urgency. There were no cold corners waiting patiently to punish the unlucky. No drafts creeping across the ground with personal vendettas. No mysterious zones where comfort simply gave up and left. The structure refused to create what modern dwellings know all too well: thermal dead spots. Anyone who has lived in a contemporary apartment understands these zones intimately. There is always one corner that never quite warms up, no matter how aggressively the heating system works. It becomes the place where plants struggle, blankets multiply, and certain family members are quietly reassigned during winter nights. No one says it out loud, but everyone knows which spot is being avoided. Inside this structure, that problem did not exist. The inner lining redirected airflow upward, preventing cold air from sliding across the floor. Fresh air entering from below was immediately guided into the warming cycle rather than allowed to roam freely and cause trouble. The lining acted like a gentle conductor, ensuring that every movement of air contributed to comfort rather than chaos. No one was ever sentenced to sleep in the bad corner. This even distribution mattered deeply. Human bodies lose heat fastest where air moves fastest. Drafts at ground level are not merely uncomfortable, they are exhausting. They interrupt sleep, they demand constant adjustment. By preventing air from racing along the floor, the structure allowed people to rest without vigilance. Warmth became background rather than obsession. The brilliance of this system lies in how little it announces itself. There are no vents to adjust manually, no dials to turn, no complicated instructions. The lining hangs at the correct height, creating a predictable airflow pattern that responds naturally to heat and gravity. When the fire burns, air moves. When the fire dims, movement slows. The system adjusts itself without commentary. This is climate control without opinion. The inner lining also softened sound. Wind noise was filtered through layers, losing its sharpness before reaching the living space. The storm outside could perform as dramatically as it wished, but inside it became a distant presence. This acoustic insulation mattered as much as the thermal one. Fear often travels faster through sound than temperature. Quiet is a form of warmth. The lining's adaptability added another layer of intelligence. In winter, it could be lowered fully, maximizing heat retention. In warmer seasons, it could be raised, allowing hot air to escape more freely. The structure did not assume a single climate. It expected change and prepared for it without rebuilding itself each time. Modern buildings often struggle here. They lock themselves into seasons, requiring significant effort to shift modes. The lining understood that comfort is seasonal, not static. It is worth noting what the lining did not do. It did not seal the interior into stagnation. Moisture could still escape. Air could still circulate. The environment inside remained breathable, balanced, and alive. Warmth did not become claustrophobic. It became sustainable. This distinction is subtle but critical. Trapped heat creates problems. Guided heat solves them. As warm air moved upward between the layers, it prevented condensation from forming on the interior surfaces. Moisture, a quiet enemy in cold environments, never had a chance to settle. Bedding stayed dry. Clothing dried efficiently. The structure avoided the slow creep of dampness that makes cold feel heavier than it already is. Again, this required no intervention. The lining also protected the outer hide from direct exposure to interior heat, extending its lifespan. Materials lasted longer because they were not forced into extremes. The system respected limits rather than testing them constantly. This respect for materials echoed the respect shown to the buffalo hide itself. Nothing here was pushed beyond necessity. Longevity was the goal, not performance theater. Inside the structure, life continued with minimal awareness of the system working around it. People cooked, they repaired tools, they told stories, they slept. The air moved quietly. In service of all these activities, never drawing attention to itself, never demanding adjustment. This is the highest compliment any system can receive. But air, for all its cooperation, has one habit that cannot be ignored. It carries smoke. Warmth can be guided gently, but smoke requires intention. Left unmanaged, it lingers, it irritates, it turns comfort into discomfort very quickly. Many shelters throughout history solved warmth only to be undone by smoke, filling interiors with haze and forcing occupants to choose between breathing and heating. This structure refused to make that choice. The inner lining prepared the way for smoke management by directing airflow upward. It created a predictable path, a gentle upward pull that invited smoke to follow the same route as warm air. But guidance alone was not enough. Smoke needed an exit, a precise one. This is where the next element waits patiently above, unnoticed by those who have never had to rely on it. The opening at the top, framed by flaps that appear modest but behave heroically, was about to reveal its purpose, because once air is in motion, it must be allowed to leave intelligently. And when smoke knows exactly where to go, the interior finally becomes what it was always meant to be, not just warm, but livable. That is where we turn next. Smoke that knew where to leave. Comfort depends not on keeping everything in, but on knowing exactly what must be allowed to leave. By the time warmth had learned how to move politely through the interior, the structure had already achieved something rare. It was insulated without being sealed, calm without being stagnant. Air circulated, heat behaved. The floor stayed free of drafts. The interior felt stable, lived in, and quietly welcoming. But there was still one element that could undo everything if mishandled. Smoke does not negotiate. Where heat can be guided and air can be persuaded, smoke demands clarity. It rises because it must. It spreads because it can. And if it is not given a clear exit, it will take the most inconvenient path available. Throughout history, countless shelters mastered warmth, only to be defeated by haze, stinging eyes, coughing nights, and interiors that felt more like endurance tests than homes. This structure avoided that fate with two modest pieces of hide placed at the very top. The smoke flaps are easy to overlook. To an untrained eye, they appear decorative, even polite. Two triangular extensions that flutter gently in the wind, as if unsure whether they belong to the structure or the sky. But these flaps were not ornaments. They were the difference between breathing comfortably and regretting every life choice that led you indoors. Centuries before chimneys became architectural status symbols, these flaps solved the same problem with far less drama. The logic was simple, but not simplistic. Smoke rises. Warm air rises with it. If you give that rising column a predictable path, it will follow it faithfully. The smoke hole at the peak of the structure became that path. The flaps, attached to long poles, allowed that opening to be adjusted with precision based on wind direction and intensity. This was not passive ventilation, it was responsive. When the fire burned at the center, small, steady, intentional, smoke drifted upward into the rising warm air, guided by the interior circulation established earlier. As it reached the top, the flaps angled themselves according to the wind outside, encouraging smoke to exit cleanly without inviting cold air back in. No complex mechanisms, no rigid chimneys, no brittle structures rising into the storm. Just two pieces of hide and an understanding of how wind behaves when no one is pretending to control it. If the wind shifted, the flaps shifted. If the fire changed, the opening adjusted. The system responded in real time, not through automation, but through attention. Someone inside could feel the airflow, watch the smoke, and make a subtle correction. It took seconds. It required no tools. It relied entirely on awareness rather than instruction. In a modern context, this would be called manual override. Here, it was simply normal life. There is a quiet humor in how advanced this appears once you slow down enough to notice it. Entire industries now exist to manage indoor air quality. Sensors, thermostats, apps, alerts, updates. Meanwhile, this system achieved balance with poles, flaps, and a practiced eye. No Wi-Fi required. No batteries to fail at inconvenient moments. You did not need an application to tell you the wind had changed. You felt it. The placement of the flaps at the peak was crucial. Warm air naturally created an upward draft, pulling smoke along with it. The flaps did not fight this movement, they refined it. By angling the opening away from the wind, smoke was encouraged to leave, while incoming cold air was discouraged from entering directly. This directional control mattered. Wind on the plains does not arrive gently. It barrels in with opinions. Without proper guidance, it would force smoke back down into the living space, undoing the calm created below. The flaps prevented this reversal by offering the wind an easier path around the structure rather than through it. Again, refusal rather than resistance. The result was an interior where smoke never lingered long enough to become a problem. Eyes did not burn. Throats did not tighten. The fire could burn steadily, without fear of turning the shelter into an accidental smoke chamber. Cooking, heating, and lighting could coexist peacefully. This balance allowed the fire to remain modest. Large fires are inefficient. They consume fuel quickly and demand constant attention. Because the structure retained heat so effectively, the fire did not need to dominate the space. A small flame was enough to maintain comfort, which in turn produced manageable amounts of smoke. Everything scaled down together. Efficiency replaced excess. The smoke flaps also played a role in temperature regulation beyond ventilation. Opening them wider allowed more heat to escape during warmer periods. Narrowing them retained warmth when temperatures plunged. The flaps acted as a thermal dial, though no one would have called it that. The beauty of this system lies in how human it remained. It required observation rather than expertise. You did not need to calculate airflow. You watched how the smoke behaved. You adjusted until it moved the way it should. The feedback was immediate and obvious. If the smoke left cleanly, the system was working. This clarity is rare. Modern systems often obscure cause and effect. When something feels wrong, you consult interfaces, manuals, or customer support. Here, the relationship between action and outcome remained direct. Adjust flap, observe smoke, breathe easily. There was also a subtle safety element embedded in this design. Because smoke exited efficiently, the risk of carbon buildup was reduced. Fires remained controlled. The interior stayed usable even during long periods of cold when ventilation elsewhere would have been impractical. This was not just comfort. It was foresight. The smoke flaps also completed the structure's conversation with the sky. The opening at the top allowed light to enter during the day, filtering softly through the hide. At night, firelight flickered upward, casting gentle movement along the interior walls. The space felt alive without feeling exposed. This connection mattered psychologically. Complete isolation from the outside world can feel oppressive. Total exposure is dangerous. The smoke hole, moderated by flaps, allowed a controlled relationship with the environment above, present but not intrusive. And with smoke now behaving, something remarkable happened. The structure stopped being a shelter and started being a place. When air moved properly and smoke knew where to leave, attention shifted inward. People no longer needed to monitor the environment constantly. The systems faded into the background, which is precisely what well-designed systems are meant to do. The fire became more than heat. It became a center. People gathered around it not out of necessity alone, but out of comfort. Cooking became routine rather than urgent. Conversations stretched longer. Hands warmed without rushing. Tools were repaired. Food was prepared. Time slowed. This is the moment where architecture steps aside and life takes over. The space did not feel like it was barely holding winter at bay. It felt settled, predictable, safe enough to forget about the weather entirely for a while. The storm could continue its performance outside. Inside, the day unfolded normally. That normalcy is the real achievement. Anyone can survive briefly by fighting conditions. Living requires stability. It requires systems that do not demand constant attention. The smoke flaps ensured that breathing remained effortless, allowing the interior to become a place of routine rather than reaction. And routine is where culture grows. Stories are told where smoke does not sting the eyes. Meals are shared where air remains clear. Children sleep soundly where warmth is steady and breathing easy. The space becomes more than a technical success. It becomes a home. With the air now fully under control, warmth circulating, smoke exiting cleanly, wind kept at a respectful distance, the structure reached a quiet equilibrium. Nothing dramatic happened next. And that is exactly the point. Because once the environment stopped demanding solutions, people were finally free to live within it. Life continued while winter failed. True comfort appears when survival stops demanding attention. Once smoke knew where to leave and warmth learned how to stay without being forced, something subtle but profound occurred. The structure stopped feeling like a solution and started feeling like a place, not a shelter to endure, not a defense to maintain, but an interior where life resumed its ordinary pace while winter exhausted itself outside. At the center of this calm sat a small fire, not a roaring blaze, not a theatrical inferno, just a steady, contained flame that behaved the way everything else in this system behaved, with restraint. This hearth was not meant to impress. It was meant to last. And because the structure around it was doing most of the work, the fire was free to remain modest without sacrificing comfort. This is where many outsiders misunderstood what they were seeing. They assumed extreme cold demanded extreme heat, bigger fires, more fuel, constant attention. But inside this structure, efficiency replaced effort. The fire did not struggle against the cold. It cooperated with a system already designed to support it. Heat rose gently, circulated naturally, and returned where people actually lived. The result was warmth that felt stable rather than aggressive. Cooking happened here not as an emergency measure, but as routine. Pots hung above the flame, food simmered slowly, hands moved without urgency. There was no need to huddle desperately or chase warmth from one spot to another. The fire gave what it was asked to give, and nothing more. Light came with it, soft and amber, filtering upward and reflecting gently off the inner walls. Shadows moved slowly, predictable and calming. Night did not arrive with fear, it arrived with familiarity. The interior glowed just enough to extend the day, without fighting darkness outright. Clothing dried nearby, suspended carefully where rising warm air could do its quiet work. Wet hides, damp garments, tools that needed attention, all found their place within this gentle circulation. Nothing steamed violently, nothing scorched. Drying happened the same way everything else did here, gradually and without drama. This was a multi-purpose fire, not because it tried to be everything, but because the space allowed it to be enough. Compare this to many European dwellings of the same era where fires were large, hungry, and demanding. Chimneys smoked, rooms remained unevenly heated, corners froze, fuel disappeared rapidly. Entire days were devoted to cutting, hauling, and feeding fires that still failed to create consistent comfort. Those houses worked harder and achieved less. Here, a smaller fire succeeded precisely because it was not alone. The shape, the insulation, the airflow, and the smoke control all worked in quiet agreement. No single element tried to compensate for the failure of another. Effort remained proportional to outcome. The Tipi trusted efficiency. It did not believe in trying harder. This philosophy extended beyond warmth into daily life itself. The interior layout followed logic shaped by comfort rather than hierarchy. Sleeping areas formed a ring along the outer edge where warmth circulated gently downward and insulation layered beneath kept the ground from stealing heat. No one slept in exile. No one was relegated to a colder space as punishment or accident. At the center, the fire acted as gravity. People gathered around it naturally, not because they had to, but because it made sense. Conversations unfolded there. Tools were repaired there. Stories found their rhythm there. The space encouraged connection without forcing it. There were no walls to isolate, no rooms competing for heat, no doors to close against one another. The openness was not a lack of privacy. It was a shared agreement. Everyone understood the balance. Everyone benefited from it. This shared warmth mattered psychologically as much as physically. Extreme cold isolates. It pushes people inward, both mentally and socially. A space that allowed everyone to remain comfortable without conflict reduced tension quietly. When no one is cold, fewer arguments feel necessary. The fire did not dominate the space. It anchored it. And because it remained small, it demanded little fuel. This mattered more than comfort. Fuel is time. Fuel is labor. Fuel is risk when the environment punishes mistakes. A system that reduced fuel needs returned time to its people, time to rest, to prepare, to live. Winter did not consume their days. This is the moment where survival transformed into continuity. The structure no longer felt temporary, even though it was. Life rhythms resumed. Morning tasks followed evening rest. Children learned. Elders taught. Work happened without constant interruption from the cold. The environment outside could rage as much as it wished. Inside, routine remained intact. That is the quiet definition of success. There is also a subtle humor in how unintentionally modern this feels. Today, efficiency is celebrated loudly. It is branded, marketed, patented. Yet here was a system that achieved it centuries ago without naming it. No slogans, no diagrams, just results. The fire did not need to be large because the structure did not leak. The people did not need to rush because warmth stayed where it was invited. Comfort was not an achievement to be celebrated daily. It was the default. When comfort becomes ordinary, something else becomes possible. Attention shifts outward. Planning extends beyond the present moment. The mind is no longer consumed by immediate needs. It begins to think seasonally, strategically, and communally. Food storage improves. Tools are maintained. Travel becomes an option rather than a risk. And this is where we begin to see the next truth. The structure was warm. It was comfortable. It supported daily life elegantly. But it was never meant to be permanent in the way stone houses were. It was not designed to root people to one location, regardless of circumstance. Because people did not live in one place. They followed seasons. They followed animals. They followed water and opportunity. A home that refused to move would have betrayed them eventually, no matter how warm it was. So while life continued inside, and winter failed to interrupt it, another requirement waited patiently in the background. Mobility. The fire could burn safely, the interior could support daily life, the structure could endure storms, but when it was time to leave, when the land shifted its offerings, the home needed to go with its people. And remarkably, it could. Which means the next question was never whether this place could survive winter. It was whether it could leave it behind. And that is where the story moves next. A home that understood movement. A truly intelligent home never assumes you are meant to stay. By the time the fire had proven it could warm without exhausting itself, and daily life had resumed its quiet rhythm inside the shelter, the structure revealed a final and perhaps most surprising truth. For all its comfort, stability, and warmth, it was never meant to keep anyone in one place for too long. Because people did not belong to a single location. They belonged to seasons, to animals, to water, to weather patterns that shifted with quiet authority across the plains. Survival here did not reward permanence. It rewarded attentiveness. A home that refused to move would eventually become a liability, no matter how well it performed in winter. This is where the structure's intelligence widened from comfort into freedom. Unlike heavy dwellings that demanded commitment, this home asked no questions. It did not inquire how long you planned to stay. It did not require justification. When it was time to leave, it cooperated. Dismantling the structure was not an act of loss. It was routine. The same poles that had stood confidently against winter winds were unlashed calmly. The hide covering, which had served faithfully as insulation and shield, was folded carefully rather than abandoned. The inner lining came down. The fire was extinguished deliberately. Nothing was torn apart. Nothing was damaged. The home did not resist its own disassembly. This process was efficient not because it was rushed, but because it was practiced. A well-organized family could take down the entire structure in a surprisingly short time. There were no nails to pry loose, no beams to wrestle with, no stubborn elements that refused to cooperate. Each part had been designed to separate as easily as it had joined. The structure disassembled itself with the same grace it had assembled. Modern furniture often claims portability. This structure delivered it. Once packed, the materials did not become dead weight. The poles transformed into transport frames. The hides became bundles. Household items followed predictable order. Dogs, and later horses, pulled travois constructed from the same materials that had supported the home itself. Nothing was single purpose. This mobility mattered deeply. Hunting patterns shifted. Herds moved. Water sources changed. Weather made decisions without consulting anyone. A community that could move its homes with minimal disruption could follow opportunity rather than chase survival desperately. The home traveled with the people, not the other way around. There is a quiet humor in how foreign this idea feels to modern life. Many people today build homes that ask uncomfortable questions immediately. How long will you live here? Can you afford to leave? What happens if your circumstances change? The structure assumes permanence even when life does not. This home assumed the opposite. It understood that staying too long in one place could be dangerous. That attachment to a single location, no matter how comfortable, could become blindness. Mobility was not instability. It was awareness. And because the home was portable, communities could gather and separate fluidly. Camps expanded for seasonal events, hunts, or ceremonies. They contracted when resources thinned. Families joined one another without logistical nightmares. Separation did not require abandonment. The structure allowed social flexibility. No one was trapped by architecture. No one had to choose between warmth and movement. Comfort traveled alongside necessity, which is a rare arrangement even in modern times. There is also an emotional layer to this mobility that often goes unnoticed. When a home is designed to move, leaving does not feel like failure. It feels like continuation. The ground you depart does not become a grave of effort and regret. It becomes part of a larger rhythm. The structure carried memory without demanding loyalty. This flexibility prevented overuse of land as well. Camps moved before resources were exhausted. Areas recovered. The relationship with the environment remained cyclical rather than extractive. Mobility was ecological intelligence expressed architecturally. The home did not consume the land. It borrowed from it briefly. And when winter returned, or storms gathered, or winds grew impatient, the structure could be raised again with the same confidence it had shown before. The shape remembered itself. The poles knew where they belonged. The hide settled into place. The lining hung. The fire returned to the center. Nothing needed to be reinvented. This repeatability created resilience. People did not fear transition. They trusted it. The structure did not demand emotional preparation to be dismantled. It asked only for attention and care. That trust changed how people experience time. Seasons were not interruptions. They were signals. Movement was not disruption. It was response. The home never insisted on permanence because permanence was never promised by the land. And here, quietly, the deeper meaning of everything we've seen begins to surface. The cone shape, the poles, the hide, the airflow, the fire, all of it worked not because each element was impressive on its own, but because they aligned around a single philosophy, one that modern architecture often forgets. Human life is not static. Comfort should not require immobility. Safety should not demand surrender to a single place. A home should support adaptation, not prevent it. This structure did not anchor people against their will. It accompanied them. It acknowledged change without fear. It treated movement not as a flaw in planning, but as the plan itself. That is a radical idea. Even today, many buildings are designed as if change is an inconvenience, as if lives are meant to unfold predictably in fixed locations. When that assumption fails, stress follows. This home never made that assumption. It offered warmth without chains, shelter without confinement, stability without stagnation. And because of that, it succeeded where heavier, more permanent structures often failed, not just against winter, but against time. So now, as we step back from the details of poles and hides and airflow, a larger question begins to form. Not about how this structure worked, but why it mattered so much. Why this quiet intelligence, refined without blueprints or applause, still feels unsettlingly relevant. Why a home that refused to stay put might understand something about human life that we are still trying to relearn. And that question carries us forward, beyond engineering, beyond climate, into meaning. Because the story of this home is not just about surviving winter. It is about how humans chose to live within a world that never promised to stay the same. When comfort was not an accident, comfort becomes extraordinary when it is never treated as a coincidence. By now it should be clear that nothing about this structure happened by chance, not the shape, not the materials, not the way air moved, smoke escaped, or warmth stayed exactly where it was needed. And yet, calling it an invention still feels slightly misleading. Inventions usually arrive with moments attached to them. A date, a name, a dramatic breakthrough followed by recognition. This did not. What we are looking at instead is something far more difficult to create and far less likely to be celebrated. A complete system that emerged slowly through attention, correction, and restraint. The tipi was not a clever idea someone had one afternoon. It was a long conversation with the environment. Each element we followed, the cone, the poles, the hide, the lining, the fire, the smoke flaps, the mobility, worked not because it was impressive in isolation, but because it refused to compete with the others. Nothing here tried to dominate the system. Nothing tried to steal attention. Each part understood its role and stayed within it. This is what makes the comfort feel intentional rather than accidental. Modern design often chases optimization in fragments. A better heater, a stronger wall, a smarter vent. Each improvement arrives loudly, usually accompanied by the suggestion that everything before it was inadequate. The result is a collection of solutions that sometimes struggle to coexist. Here, coexistence was the goal from the beginning. The structure did not optimize for power. It did not need to intimidate the landscape or signal permanence. It did not announce ownership. There were no thick walls meant to impress, no vertical dominance meant to declare authority. It did not say, "I am here to stay," because that would have been dishonest. Nor did it optimize for display. Nothing about this structure existed to be admired from a distance. It did not demand to be photographed at the right angle. It did not care how it looked to outsiders unfamiliar with its logic. Its beauty, if we insist on using that word, was a side effect of coherence rather than decoration. This absence of performative design is striking. Many structures throughout history exist partly to remind others who built them. This one existed to make sure the people inside could sleep. That difference changes everything. The priorities were quiet and practical. Survival without exhaustion, warmth without obsession, shelter without confinement. Community mattered more than status. Function mattered more than symbolism. Comfort was not a luxury to be earned. It was a baseline to be protected. And that baseline was shared. The interior did not privilege one person over another. Heat did not collect in a single room reserved for importance. Space was arranged to keep everyone within the same envelope of comfort. This was not accidental egalitarianism. It was the natural outcome of a design that refused hierarchy where it was unnecessary. The structure did not care who you were. It cared where the wind came from. That indifference to status is deeply unsettling to systems built on display. You cannot signal wealth easily inside a space designed to distribute warmth evenly. You cannot hoard comfort without disrupting the whole. The design itself discourages imbalance. This is indigenous thinking made architectural. Indigenous knowledge is often misunderstood as static tradition. In reality, it is dynamic systems thinking refined without abstraction. It does not separate disciplines. Climate, materials, movement, and social life are not treated as independent problems. They are recognized as parts of the same loop. The Tipi embodies that loop. The shape respects wind. The materials respect availability. The mobility respects seasons. The interior respects human bodies. The community respects balance. None of this is framed as philosophy. It is simply how things are done when mistakes are expensive and applause is irrelevant. And perhaps that is why this system feels so unfamiliar now. We live in a world where comfort is often accidental, produced by excess energy, temporary abundance, or hidden infrastructure we rarely think about. When it fails, we call it inconvenience rather than design error. We are insulated from consequences long enough to forget how intentional comfort must be when nothing is guaranteed. Here, comfort was never assumed. It was built carefully, preserved thoughtfully, and shared deliberately. When it failed, people noticed immediately. That awareness sharpened the system over time rather than dulling it. There is also a quiet irony in how modern sustainability conversations circle back to ideas already solved here. Energy efficiency, passive heating, adaptive architecture, minimal waste, local materials, seasonal movement. These are not innovations rediscovered. They are acknowledgments delayed. The difference is context. These solutions emerged not from ideology, but from necessity. They were not marketed. They were lived. They did not aim to save the world. They aimed to survive within it, without burning everything in the process. And because of that, they lasted. The system did not break when one element aged or failed. It adjusted. Hides were repaired. Poles were replaced selectively. The structure evolved without abandoning its logic. Continuity mattered more than novelty. This is perhaps the most subversive aspect of all. In a culture obsessed with improvement, this structure improved by staying coherent rather than changing direction. It refined rather than reinvented. It did not mistake complexity for progress. And that restraint is difficult to maintain. When you step back and view the system as a whole, something becomes uncomfortably clear. The intelligence here does not belong to any single moment or individual. It belongs to attention sustained across time. It belongs to communities willing to notice what worked, discard what didn't, and resist unnecessary escalation. That kind of intelligence does not leave monuments. It leaves continuity. Comfort in this system was not something stumbled upon. It was designed, tested, adjusted, and protected. It existed not as indulgence, but as infrastructure for life. When comfort fails, everything else becomes harder. When it works quietly, culture has space to breathe. And that brings us to the final tension. And because while this structure solved problems that many societies struggled with for centuries, it did so without permanence. It did not anchor itself to land. It did not claim territory in stone. It did not aim to outlast generations visibly. Instead, it outlasted them functionally. The knowledge survived even when the structures themselves were taken down. The system traveled in memory, practice, and habit. It adapted to new conditions without losing its core principles. That is, durability of a different kind. So when we ask why this matters, the answer is not nostalgia. It is not romanticism. It is recognition. Recognition that comfort does not need to be loud to be sophisticated, that survival does not require domination, that communities can build systems aligned with nature rather than armored against it. And perhaps most quietly radical of all, recognition that a home can be designed around human life as it actually unfolds, moving, adapting, changing, rather than how we wish it would behave. The Tipi did not promise permanence. It promised reliability. It did not optimize for power or display. It optimized for living together, season after season, without exhausting the people or the land. Comfort here was not an accident. It was the result of a worldview that understood one simple truth. If you listen carefully enough to the world you live in, you don't need to shout back at it. And with that understanding in place, we arrive at the final moment of this journey, not to add new information, but to let everything we've seen settle. Because some systems explain themselves best when they are allowed to rest. The shapes that didn't need credit. Some forms of intelligence are so quiet that they never ask to be noticed. There are things in history that never asked to be called brilliant. They did not arrive with names attached. They did not come with manifestos, signatures, or moments where someone stood back and said, "Yes, this will impress people for centuries." They simply worked. And perhaps that is why they are so easy to underestimate. The shape we've been sitting with tonight never demanded credit. It didn't ask to be admired, archived, or explained in footnotes. It didn't insist on being remembered correctly. It didn't even insist on being remembered at all. It stood, it held, it warmed, and when the moment passed, it came down again without complaint. That kind of confidence is rare. We tend to associate intelligence with visibility, with complexity, with things that announce themselves loudly so no one misses the effort involved. We reward systems that look impressive even when they struggle. We forgive failure if it looks complicated enough. But this structure did none of that. It didn't impress winter, it didn't challenge the wind, it didn't posture against the snow. It simply didn't collapse. And in an environment where collapse was the most common outcome, that was enough. There is something almost unsettling about how little this system cared about recognition. It did not seek permanence. It did not try to outlast time through stone or monument. It allowed itself to be temporary without becoming fragile. It trusted repetition over permanence, memory over material. Modern thinking often assumes that durability requires weight, that to last, something must anchor itself deeply and refuse to move. This shape quietly disagreed. It lasted by being willing to leave. That contradiction is not dramatic. It is calming. Nothing here rushed, nothing forced outcomes. When the season changed, the structure did not resist. It adjusted or it disappeared, knowing it could return without having to prove itself again. That is not insecurity. That is assurance. We live surrounded by objects that want to be admired, homes that announce wealth, buildings that demand attention, technologies that insist they are revolutionary, even when they break quietly in the background. This structure asked for none of that. It didn't care if you noticed how well it handled wind. It didn't mind if you misunderstood its simplicity. It didn't try to explain itself when dismissed. It allowed misunderstanding to pass the same way it allowed snow to pass, without sticking. And maybe that is the deepest lesson it offers, without ever trying to teach. There is a kind of intelligence that does not scale itself for applause. It does not optimize for admiration. It does not convert function into performance. It remains calm even when overlooked, because it is already doing what it was meant to do. Keeping people warm, keeping air moving, keeping life ordinary in extraordinary cold. No slogans required. As we let this story settle, notice how little effort it takes to hold everything together in your mind. There is no dramatic twist to remember, no final reveal, no clever ending where the system suddenly becomes something else. It remains exactly what it was from the beginning. A shape that listened carefully. A structure that cooperated instead of competing. A home that did not need to prove it belonged. And maybe that is why it feels appropriate to let it fade quietly rather than conclude loudly. Some histories end with declarations. This one ends with stability, with the simple acknowledgement that night after night, season after season, people slept, while the world outside did what it always does. Wind blew, snow fell, cold arrived on schedule. And inside, nothing dramatic happened. No collapse, no emergency, no heroic struggle against the elements. Just warmth, continuing to exist. If there is irony here, it is gentle. The most intelligent thing in this story never tried to sound intelligent. It never claimed innovation. It never framed itself as a solution. It simply refused to fail. And perhaps in a world that often confuses effort with effectiveness, that is the most restful thought to carry into sleep, that some things do not need to be called genius. They only need enough time to quietly prove they were right. The Tipi did not try to impress history. It just stayed standing. And maybe when everything else has finished explaining itself, that is the quietest form of intelligence there is.